All right. Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. If you're a little bit lost with all the local government climate change programs and protocols and trends and information that's going on out there at the moment, you're not alone. We're going to have a talk today about CCR, CPP, CCP, C40, CDP, and all of those other acronyms. We're also going to look at targets, science-based targets, NCOS, GPC Protocol, and why we think it's time for councils to start decoupling their greenhouse gas profiles from targets. My name is Alexi Lynch. I'm the business manager at Ironbark Sustainability. With me is Paul Brown, the managing director of Ironbark, and on the line from Tasmania is Matt Sullivan from HUTS, who has been assisting us and working with us closely for the last couple of years on data and broader programs. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. Most of you I know have been to webinars before, but for those who haven't, only presenters can be heard during the presentation. You're encouraged to ask questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into your GoToWebinar question box. We'll try to answer them as we go along, but it's a really tight agenda today, and we had a lot of questions in advance, as I'll get to in a second, so we may wait until the end or even have a follow-up discussion or webinar. If you do ask a question, please try to be specific and as clear as possible. On to today, the agenda, all those items are there as you would have seen at the start and in the invitation. However, we've just moved a few things around in order. That's the basic structure, but what we're going to do is we've collated all of the questions that we received in advance, and we're going to link them to the agenda items. So what you'll see throughout is a little thing that comes up saying, hey, this is a question. And these are questions that came in advance to us that we will ask or we will answer throughout the day. Look, we'll probably also, if we get time, discuss a few things as a panel, and we will possibly, likely disagree on some things, and that's totally okay as well, and invite people, all attendees, to also disagree or put forward information through that question box. As I mentioned earlier. Again, we might not get to everything today, but if you bring any valuable points along, then jump on and provide us with information or say, no, I disagree, that's not true, and we'll take it on board. And we'll also share it all with everyone post-webinar. Now, one of the feedback we've had in the past from our webinars is we wish we knew who else was on the line. Well, there you go. These people who are in attendance or organisations, we've probably got about 70 odd, I think it might have been up to 83 when we finished. There are some multiple individuals from some of the organisations, and we've removed a few for reasons, because they're not councils or they're other consultants. Their names don't come up, but they're still listening to this webinar. Hello to all of you out there. So yeah, it's a bit hard to actually let everyone talk and see faces because of different internet restrictions, but maybe that's one for the future. Let's move on. Now, I'm going to start way back in 2008, the Beijing Olympics. Remember, this was a happier time. We had lots of, well, an angrier time for some people as well. It was a time of an inconvenient truth, or an inconvenient truth that equals a prequel, as some people might want to put it. It was the time of grand and big national and international programs in Australia and throughout the world. And quite a few councils were involved in these grand projects and programs, about 230, 240 of them, for example, who had targets. Now, not so much. We asked everyone in advance of this webinar whether you had a corporate target or not. 43% yes, 38 no, 19% not sure. Compare this to the exact same question in June 2016 that we asked before a webinar we had last year. Pretty similar, but it seems that there's more people that don't have targets, which is interesting. Pretty big sample sizes, both of those. Someone asked, what are the pros and cons of having targets and or joining alliances? Interesting question. Any of the alliance people out there, I know they're there. If you want to give us a quick 20-second elevator pitch, then please do. But certainly our view is that if you're in certainly one of the Victorian alliances or the New South Wales Rocks, then you should definitely be joining and engaging and working with them because they do some incredible work. Targets are critically important. I think it should be straightforward enough. two primary goals, I guess, to provide a basis to understand the scale of actions required and to have a common platform for communication between collaborators and potential collaborators. We're going to look into science-based targets a little bit later on, so we might discuss it a little bit more then. Suffice to say, there are lots of different targets out there that councils have had in the past, whether it's net emissions or per capita, especially for those councils that are in growth areas, just energy or just CO2 targets, broader renewable energy targets, energy efficiency targets, etc. There's a lot of councils carbon neutral targets at the moment. Going through this start very quickly because we think a lot of it is common knowledge. You will also be able to receive a copy of the presentation post-webinar too. Community targets, not much has changed there from the last few weeks or today from last year. Most councils do not have community targets at the moment, and that's our understanding anecdotally as well. I saw this last year, BZE, and there was a bit of media around this as a few different programs came up in the Cities Power Partnership talking about how 1 in 5 councils had zero emissions or 100% renewables targets, and I think 80% had targets full stop. I don't think that's correct. My view is that they didn't have a proper enough sample size or possibly didn't engage enough, maybe looked at old targets. Certainly back in the CCP days, as mentioned way back in 2008, they did, but not so much anymore. They have gone off the radar a bit. They are, however, coming back. This was an interesting question around aligning strategic plans with sustainable development goals. I'm going to be really quick here, but for the person that did ask that question, Matt Sullivan, who is on the line from Tasmania, has provided a one-page response that we'll send through and we'll make available to everyone. But look, I've always wanted to say when I was in New York last year. So when I was in New York last year, I met with the city council over there. New York's very different, obviously, to other councils in Australia, but they have aligned their vision with community development goals. It's a really fascinating document. Check out NYC or One New York, and you'll see how they align the quality and climate, the impact of climate change on food and health with their strategy. So ticking off on a lot of those global development goals. Especially in a situation in New York, of course, where they had Hurricane Sandy recently, and the impacts that did have on the community and climate change. It was really interesting. It's a good question. Check it out. Have a look. We'll send a bit more information on afterwards. It's probably only really relevant, in my view, for those councils that have the resourcing, but nevertheless one to be aware of. All right. Traditionally, the drivers for councils to set targets were budget available to undertake action, having support from executive level, having an understanding of the actions that could be undertaking. This is, I think, actually one of the key ones, so the council officer manager influences. The quality of baseline data, what everyone else is doing, targets of other councils and state and federal government. So anyone who delves into history will realise that a lot of councils have 20% by 2020 targets. A lot of councils had 20% reduction by 2012 at one stage, aligning with Kyoto Protocol, kind of what everyone else is doing. Or when we've got councillors involved and the expectations of the broader community. Science-based targets have been in our eye for quite a while now, a couple of years. Essentially, science-based targets involve carbon budget that we have as an international community, brought down to what Australia's carbon budget is, and then possibly, still early thinking, how we divide that up into councils and communities. So Climate Works, who are an exceptional organisation, have done a lot of high-level work and modelling around this, and in conjunction with the Climate Change Authority, we see that we in Australia have a carbon budget of 10.1 gigatons of CO2 to give us a reasonable chance of avoiding more than 2 degrees of warming. Now, 2 degrees probably isn't enough. So when we look at 1.5 degrees, we think it's down around the 6 to 7 gigatons. Now, what I'm going to do here is try to patch in Matt, because Matt has been doing some work recently on this, and the news might not be too good about what we need to do to stay under 1.5 degrees. Matt, what do we have to do to stay under 1.5 degrees?
Well, basically immediately return to the Stone Age, I guess. So the figures you actually put up there, Lex, so that's not totally accurate. The 10.1 gigaton CO2 is an a figure that's derived from the target set through the IPCC work. The 6 to 7 gigatons CO2, we're basically sitting at the moment. So when that target was set in 2013, we've since obviously continued to emit. And we've been emitting as a nation roughly in the vicinity of 500 to 550 megatons of CO2 per annum. So we're currently sitting with an allowable budget of around 7.5 gigatons of CO2 remaining budget. So we've seen a roughly sort of a 20-ish to 25% reduction in that target, in that available budget since 2013. So obviously that's eroding relatively quickly. It does add some urgency to the overall outcome. What it does is it pushes up our annual reduction percentage for a linear reduction from a required 2.6% to a required 3.6%, which is still broadly, based on what we understand, within the achievable marks, but obviously increases the challenge. So this target, this 10.1 is the 2 degrees. For the 1.5 degrees, that target's actually significantly less. It's worth bearing in mind that both targets for the 2 and the 1.5 were set for absolute greenhouse emissions that were allowable to be retained within the atmosphere. So that obviously incorporates all historical emissions. So the remaining budget for the 1.5 was very tight. Currently, for Australia's allocation, we have about 425 megatons of budget remaining to remain under the 1.5 degrees, which, as you might note, is actually less than 1 year of our current emissions.
Okay, that's good news, Matt. Thank you for that. 425 megatons. We'll appreciate that. We'll come back to you later where we could be a little bit, well, we won't swear on this, well, not yet anyway. Okay, so 425 megatons between all of us in the next year. A little bit more if we want to keep ourselves within the reasonable chance of staying under 2 degrees. There are a couple of ways that councils can look at science-based targets. Now, we did hold a webinar on this last year in a little bit more detail. So those that have seen these slides before, don't worry, we're going to be going through it quite quickly. Those that have not seen this before, we do have a longer version actually going through these 4 different ways that we believe, the 4 options that councils could develop their own science-based targets. The first is to just follow the Climate Change Authority and adapt to the same goal. So this is a goal that hasn't been adopted by the federal government as yet, but you could say, well, 30% below 2000 by 2025 is our target, and that is science-based. That's debatable. That certainly is one view and one way that you put it forward, and it would be a very simple way to put it forward. Another way is to look at population-based scaling. Very simple to calculate. It's essentially now looking at the total carbon budget that we have nationally, and then apportioning the amount that your municipality has based on your portion of the population. So this is what Moreland did in Victoria, and it's worth having a look at their documentation to see how that was done. It's still relatively simple, mind you. Then Moreland having done that was quite a remarkable achievement and a bit of work, and worth investigating further. Thirdly, you can look at a more representative budget, looking at additional data. So taking into consideration that some councils and some regions can reduce their emissions a lot more quickly and cheaper than others. You can look at, as well as population, deeper data, so looking at issues around relative socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage between councils and sectoral breakdown. So looking at the scale of opportunity that each sector has, buildings, transport and industry, for example, it's different in each time. So taking that into consideration. So it's not just it's not just councils, for example, in the cities who have a lot more stationary energy that can easily reduce emissions, but also those that might be bearing the brunt of more agricultural-based emissions also have a way of sharing that load, I guess. And finally, a nationally agreed approach, nationally or locally determined contributions. We don't have a nationally agreed approach. It would be good if we did, because then we could be comparing apples with apples. This is the sort of thing that could be looking at a similar approach that is similar to the cost adjusters that are used by state government to distribute federal grant funding to local government. So looking at all these sort of criteria and factors. It's interesting, I know that Darebin City Council recently released their climate emergency plan, and I haven't had a chance to look through it yet, but speaking to one of the Darebin councils quite recently, they said their version of the science-based target is let's just get to zero as soon as possible. That's what the science says, which is really good. I like that. I think it's still important to have a target and a date for a target, but it was an interesting way of looking at it. They're the 4 ways. All right. How are we going for time? So corporate emissions data and NCOS. Now we said at the start who has a corporate target, and most do, we think, or most did, and still quite a few do, which we assume then most also have a corporate inventory as well. Here are a couple of questions that we had in advance of the webinar. Thank you to the first person who said the list looks good. Maybe a quick overview of NCOS and NCOS, of course. What are the sort of data sources that councils should be chasing? How do you measure Scope 3? So NCOS and NGAs. NCOS in plain English, I guess, provides the methodology for organisations voluntarily seeking to be carbon neutral. NGAs in plain English is the Common National Reporting Platform. So NGAs is a national act and legislation, and it defines the different scopes, 1, 2, 3, etc., consistent with international principles. NCOS also will explain the scopes a bit, but it's around calculating your carbon account and setting boundaries so you can offset to the extent that you can become carbon neutral. This can be quite simple, corporate emissions, collating your Scope 1 and 2 emissions plus street lighting with Scope 3 because it's one that you have a certain amount of control over. Fleet, electricity consumption, waste management, gas consumption, you can see there. And also divided up into scopes. Now, I know this is going to be straightforward to a lot of people out there, but this is the difference between the various scopes. So Scope 1, direct emissions, your waste, your vehicles and your plant, your buildings resulting from LPG gas on site. Scope 2 is mainly going to be your buildings from electricity from the grid. And Scope 3, street lighting, buildings as well, fuel cycle components and vehicles, full fuel cycle components as well. To me, I always think this can be really simple, and certainly for, I'd imagine, 90% of councils out there, it really should be simple, and there's no need to get too strung up on NCOS, and certainly I wouldn't be recommending most councils go down the line of trying to become carbon neutral because it can be quite costly and time consuming. We're lucky enough today to have in this room Ronald Lee from Ironbark, who is currently undertaking or doing this work for the City of Moreland. He's been at Moreland a few days a week for the last few months to develop their NCOS accredited inventory. Ronald, in like a minute or so, like what does it take? I mean, we develop inventory for councils for pretty small amounts, and we just get their billing data and fleet data, and then there you go, we're pretty close. Certainly if you're resource constrained, we wouldn't suggest paying 30, 40 grand to get an NCOS accredited inventory. What does it take?
Hi everyone. So the first year would be the most time consuming because you're actually identifying your sources of emissions and identifying, where you get your data from and putting that all together in a spreadsheet. But once that's set up, the subsequent years get easier and easier because you know the data sources, you know the context, you can put it together And from after year 1, it's just a matter of collecting data from the same sources.
Costly? Costly. First thing, so would I be right in saying that for most councils, it can be done at a simpler and cheaper sort of process by just essentially getting the billing data? Like, how much does refrigerant and LPG or gas bottles at every individual barbecue that a council might have? Is that going to be a big component of their inventory, or is that something they can just use or model even?
I guess it ranges from council to council, but the big ticket items are what you mentioned before, so electricity, gas, water, and transport. So if you can get that, and I know most councils can't really get the full set of data for that, but you could just do a materiality check, look for the biggest sources in each category, and then, like for example, your aquatic centers for electricity, and civic centers, because those are the biggest consumer of electricity. And eventually going on to the smaller categories like childcare centers. But if you don't have that information, you can always estimate it based on, similar buildings from. Yeah.
And that will be considered okay, according to Inga's?
Just to begin with, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Ronald. Any questions, please keep them coming. We'll try and get to them, as I said. However, at the moment, we'll stick with the questions that we've had as we've carried on through, or we had in advance. So goodbye, Albert. And we'll move on to community data. So I guess the sheer scale of it, looking at NCOS, for example, if you look at carbon neutrality for your corporate, your own internal operations, for some of the leading councils, I think there's 5 or 6 now Australia-wide, Yarra, Moreland, Sydney, around this room. There are 1 or 2 others, and I apologise. There's another one in New South Wales, in Sydney Metro. It's not that big a deal compared to the sort of budgets and resources that they have. Certainly, don't look at some of the questions might have alluded to this, looking at NCOS for a municipality. So for most councils, the corporate emissions are only going to represent 1.5% of your total emissions for the municipality. So your capacity to influence these will be significantly lower than for your own corporate emissions. So you'd be expending a very extremely large amount of offsets without any guarantee the situation will change in the future if you want to try and offset the municipality. Our approach is certainly for councils to focus on implementing change within their municipality rather than sort of artificially inducing the zero net emissions through offset programs for the community. Which brings us to community data. If you're developing a community profile, you need to be using GPC, or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's robust. It's the basis for all community inventories now. Everyone's on board, I guess, is key to this. So this is a protocol that was developed and had input from all of these organisations. I know I've got, I think, someone from ICLEA there on the line. Please speak up as well if I'm not representing this as exactly as it is. But the protocol that you really should be using for community, municipal-wide emissions profiles is GPC. Some of the questions we had, around GPC, so particularly interested in emissions data collection and reporting, and best practice inventory, emissions inventory by LGA boundary, which we'll take the comment. We're going to come back to this later as far as best practice is concerned, but I guess at a basic level, for a GPC community-wide inventory, you're looking at stationary energy. So this is generally one of the largest contributors to a city's emissions. Combustion of fuel in residential, commercial, institutional buildings, facilities, manufacturing, industries, and construction. Transportation, so all journeys by road, rail, water, air, including intercity and international travel. And waste, so waste disposal and treatment produces emissions through aerobic or anaerobic decomposition or incineration in some countries, and solid waste as well. There are also some other sectors that have little asterisks around them at the moment, because to get a compliant GPC inventory, a compliant basic inventory, you need to cover off on those first 3. If you include those last 2, would be considered a basic plus inventory. So the one on the bottom left with the asterisk is industrial process and product use. So emissions from a wide variety of non-energy related industrial activities. So releases from industrial processes that chemically or physically transform materials, iron, steel industry. And the other one is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So livestock, land use and land use changes. At the very start, the basic inventory, those top three, can be undertaken and compliant with the protocol straightforward enough now, once you have a lot of data analysis and research at the start. Those other ones you can hold off for a year or two, we would suggest. These councils have GPC compliant profiles. There might be others in Australia. If you're one of those and we've left you off the list, please jump in and say, hey, put me on the list. They've all gone through the process and had their profiles independently verified. So community data, you develop your profile, you make it all look nice. There we go, there's where it's all from. We're going to get into that a little bit later, but first we're going to stop. Just like having Adani there, but we're just going to stop and come back to best practice community data, because the next little section about programs is probably good to have as context. All right. What's going on here? Not another bloody program is what we were going to call this, but instead this was our wonderfully titled thing. Now, Paul Brown is with me here, and Paul wasn't sure what WTF meant. It's not that, Paul. It's not Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. It's not Wireless Telecommunications Foundation. It's not Welcome to Finland either. We're quite polite here, so we would never want to swear, but whatever. We're just going to come straight out and say, what's going on with all these programs? Hey, Compact of Mayors, Zero Carbon Communities, Take Two, City Power Partnership. These are some of the leading ones. These are some of the ones we're going to focus in a little bit of detail today. We've provided a few extra acronyms at the start. So I'm going to quickly also go through some of the others that we're not going to talk about, but we'll provide information on post this webinar. CCP. This is Cities for Climate Protection. It was Australia's largest local government program. It was a program. It's not a program anymore. Technically, that might not be true, and I'm sure I'll get corrected by ICLEI people if they're on the line. But for all intents and purposes, the CCP program finished in about 2009-10, when a big chunk of federal government funding was cut. Very successful program. CCR, this is not a program. It is a registry. It is a platform. Any council in Australia and everyone listening right now can jump on to CCR and for free start your own profile or register, and you can have a bit of a look and have a play around, but it's where you can place your inventory, your corporate inventory, your community profile, your actions, lots of different stuff. Definitely worth having a look. CCR is the registry. GPC we've just discussed, but I'll just keep it in here as well. It's the protocol that says this is how you should be counting for your community emissions. C40 could be called a program, they call it a network. C40 has been a very successful program or network. It's really supposed to be for the world's megacities. This might be changing if anyone out there knows more than us around whether they're looking at working with, say, broader, Sydney metropolitan or Melbourne metro as opposed to just those capital cities, then let me know. But otherwise, C40 is really for the major mega cities around the world. CDP comes up a little bit because CDP is very closely aligned and working with the international program. So formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, it runs disclosure systems. And so their focus certainly in Australia and Asia is more around companies as opposed to local government. And finally, just to be really confusing, we have a new CCP, a new acronym anyway, refers to the City Climate Plan Certificate Program. This is a program that the World Bank has been or has developed and is piloting at the moment for people to become experts. Oh, Rob, yes. Cities Climate Partnership. Do you mean City Power Partnership? If so, we're going to get to that. We might have this one there. Yes, the climate one. We'll come to that. So these were just what we're going to do here, just to clarify. We're going to have a look at these four. I just thought I'd quickly touch on these ones that we're not going to look into in great detail. And let's move on to the first one, which is going to be the Compact of Mayors. Compact of Mayors, this is the leading international program. It also is sort of moving to the side as it has merged with a thing called the Covenant of Mayors. So the Compact of Mayors was founded, released 5 or 6 years ago, whereas the Covenant of Mayors has been around for a lot longer and is more European-based. These two have merged about a year and a half ago to form the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. For all intents and purposes, at least for this discussion, we're going to use those terms interchangeably, especially the Compact of Mayors or the Global Covenant. But where it sits at the moment is that if a council commits, you're committing to the Global Covenant. I think you're also committing to the Compact of Mayors. The Compact of Mayors was based more in the United States, or that's where it started, whereas the Covenant is very European central. So Australian councils can't really commit to the Covenant of Mayors because you're aligning yourselves and your council with European Union goals. These are the councils in Australia that have committed to the Compact of Mayors. Here, let's see that freezing. This is what you have to do. Sorry, now this past computer, thank you. Really straightforward component that is pretty much, climate action 101 really. Submitting an inventory, a reduction target, a plan, and doing stuff. The Compact of Mayors has a lot of organisations working together, which is one of the benefits. You don't have to register any sort of special Compact of Mayors target or adaptation plan or climate plan. You don't have to replace the work that you're doing. It's more of a wrapper on the existing work. It's been developed by people that have local government backgrounds from all around the world and Australia. We think it's a really good program. If it was going to do any of the above, we would quite happily say it's not worth it, don't do it, but you don't have to develop these special things. And so it can really tie nicely with what a lot of councils are already doing. It doesn't cost anything. Commit, contact ICLEI here in Australia if this is of interest to you. Zero Carbon Community. So this is a program that's been developed by BZE. Those that don't know BZE, they are a fantastic organisation that have been around for, I think, probably 10 years now. Most recently, they've been involved in the Repowering Port Augusta project, which you can Google if you want more information. But they've been doing a lot of great work for a hell of a long time in Australia. The Zero Carbon Communities framework looks a little bit like this. From what we can see, it's a little bit more sort of community-based or grassroots. They've got a vision for an ever-growing network of communities across Australia working together to achieve zero carbon. Certainly the community side of things seems to reign true and strong throughout. Byron is a really good example of a council that is using this framework, and I think it makes a lot of sense given the community that they have up there. Certainly one worth having a bit more of a look into. Possibly one that community groups can use to try and even help, push action within their council. This is the most recent one. So the Climate Council released the City Powers Partnership recently. So the Climate Council, for those that don't know, not to be confused with the Climate Group, also do a lot of really amazing work. They used to be government funds, but they're not anymore. They provide science information on science and climate change. They've got a lot of really well-known people involved, like Mr. Flannery there, and people have probably seen them the work that they do over the last couple of years. They bring a massive media and promotional case to the work that they do. And the City Power Partnership probably received more media coverage in the first week of being launched than every single one of the other programs over the last 10 years. Here are the partners. I think there's about 30, 35 of them now. It's an interesting mix of councils. What you have to do, from what we can gather, is pledge to take action, connect and share between participants. You have exclusive access to domestic and international experts. I think probably the last point is the most critical as far as this is concerned, dedicated to helping councils with publicising their work and their media online. So they're well placed to profile councils and what they're doing. So I think it's actually leading to any new action at the moment. Perhaps it will in the future, especially if and when they start connecting leading councils with councils that possibly haven't started implementing many projects yet. But from a promotional point of view, it's absolutely fantastic. They've also got tools, power analytics. Can't read the rest of that. And they've got also worth knowing they've got 3 years of funding. So it'll be also good to know what happens after that. So the tool, this is what it looks like. Hopefully it's going to change, because at the moment it looks like it's more tailored to universities and educational institutions in the United States. There is information on CPP. I'm going to go through this last one incredibly quickly because it's Victorian only. It's a pledge. Ironbark has taken the pledge to take 2. It's not just for councils, so it's also for organisations, businesses, people. 650 organisations have submitted climate change action across Victoria so far. Certainly Sustainability Victoria, one of the leading agencies in Australia, has been pushing this, recruiting councils, and about to start moving on the next steps. There is where you go to find information on Take 2. So which of these 4 is for you? First of all, it might be good to look at some criteria to get an idea about what you would be after. So we surveyed councils a few years ago now, and we had a bunch of questions around various things, including programs. And we seem to come up with this little summary of what a good program is, what you need. I'll just stop for 3 seconds while people can actually have a read of that. This is from analysis of information that came back from the sector. This is what we think a good program should be. We're not going to fill this in yet. We will post-webinar and give you an idea about what we think each of these programs does according to those criteria, and everyone can receive a quick report on that after the program. But looking at some of the specific questions that people had, sense of which of the various options had support, what's the best one, etc. The overall support, compact of mayors, the City Power Partnership, it might be capped at the moment though, and certainly Take 2 in Victoria has, I think, even getting close to half of all the councils in Victoria involved. My understanding is the only climate change pledge programs are Take 2 and the City Power Partnership. The others aren't actually pledges. The most successful local government programs addressing community-wide emissions targets would definitely be the compact of mayors. And what to consider in supporting, participating multiple programs that use similar metrics. Or I guess this is about maybe alignment. My kind of view and thoughts would be to get them to bloody work together. That's the thing that I find I'm hearing from the sector is the most frustrating part of things. I think it's pretty likely that Take 2, for example, will align with the compact of mayors, or at least with GPC, and work together and use the same sort of reporting processes. I'm not sure about City Power Partnership though. There's certainly no relationship between CPP and the compact of mayors or ICLEI at the moment, like what you may have seen. It would be great if they were working systematically together. We will send through the list of each of those, how they respond to each of those criteria here after this webinar.
It's Paul here. One thing it's good to consider to be quite mercenary about these and think about which one to use for which purpose. So the information that Lex is going to send through will give a bit of a breakdown of each of the different programs. But as we've heard, the CPP, for example, has great media and communication. So you use it for that purpose. While the Compact of Mayors has a great framework around data and targets and all that sort of thing. So use it for that purpose. There's no reason why you have to pick one. The key issue is being mercenary around your time and your capacity and exactly what it is you want to get out of it.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Okay, if any questions are there, you can keep them coming. Otherwise, we're going to move on to decoupling profiles from targets. So I apologise for that little detour into programs, but because some of the programs involve profiles or greenhouse profiles, community profiles, we thought it would be valuable. Just responding or reminding where we were. We had stopped. We were talking about the GPC protocol or standard, and then we were talking about community data, stationary energy, transport, waste, and somewhere down the line, industrial processes and agriculture. We're then talking about how, using that information and data, we develop community profiles, or what we used to call them community inventories. We used to say, here are all our emissions in our whole municipality by scope. Here they are, broken up nicely another way. We think it's time to stop. We don't think anyone really can put their hand on their heart and say, this is our community profile and we're very confident in it. And we don't think we've ever really been able to. And it's time to rethink things. Decoupling GHG profiles from your targets for now, big caveat there. Council's profiles, GPC or broader municipal profiles, we used to call them inventories. There were 200 councils that had them, 7 or 8 years ago. They were never really inventories and they were not baselines because they were not accurate. Even now, we have a lot better data for some sectors, but unless someone can show us otherwise, and please tell us in your question box otherwise if you think you have a community profile that is actually an inventory and it's a baseline and we're consistent, confident in it, let us know, but otherwise we think it's not. It will change a lot and we think councils can have multiple compliant profiles depending on their methodology. And we think councils should never use community profile to report success. What we've traditionally done as a sector is we've looked at our corporate thinking. So here's some dummy data for a corporate inventory looking at council, whatever you want to call them, and here's how their emissions are tracking over time in each of their sectors. And we've grabbed that and used it and applied it to the community sector. This will be a familiar one. We've said here's our baseline, our community baseline emissions is 800,000 tonnes. It's going to go up to 900,000 if we don't do something. So we're going to do all this stuff to bring it down to 700,000 tonnes. Familiar? Makes sense with corporate inventories. Doesn't make sense with community. But this is what we've been doing. We said we're going to reduce it. Here's how we're going to do it. We're going to put solar everywhere. Gas is going to be gone. We're going to do off-grid stuff. Excuse me for a moment while my throat recovers. And we're going to save trillions of tonnes of CO2 a year. Organics is all going to be on a landfill. All our lights will be LED and we're going to use big sticks. Now, don't look at this as real data because it's not. I've just made some numbers up there, but the point is that we've tried to tie community action or things that councils and we as a sector have worked on and then linked it back to the profile. All of these actions, all of the great stuff that is done, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting these things can't still be done and shouldn't still be done. All of those community projects, they sit within the margin of error of our baseline. I think they always have. And then we wonder why it doesn't add up and we get angry. That's one of my favourites.
Well, Lex gets angry.
Paul's son with Paul's hand. What looks good. It isn't going to add up. It will eventually, but at the moment, it will not. Here are some questions and some points that people brought up. I'm intrigued by the last point. Thank you. This is pretty newish thinking, and I'm very thankful to Matt, who spoke before, who is the leading thinker, I think, in Australia on this sort of stuff. How do you continue to tell your story when the numbers don't add up? My response to that is, how did you tell your story when the numbers didn't add up? Because they never did. What did we do? What are we doing? What are all these councils going to do when they hit their 2020 targets? And of course, they're not going to be able to measure them and compare them with the initial baseline. It's going to get better, but it's not there yet. When we start using smart data, we now have information on cars travelling, and we know exactly when and where they're moving, thanks to Uber. We're getting into the realm of autonomous vehicles. Everyone has a GPS tracker on them. So this data will get better. Certainly some data is already okay and quite valuable and accurate, especially, say, stationary energy for the residential sector. Some of it just all over the shop. So let's decouple them. We can have our targets, we can have our inventory, and then we can talk about the stuff that we're going to do in our plan. And it's going to be key to communicate it. For example, this could be something that you have in a community action plan or community profile document. This is what we're going to do to reduce emissions with the community. You start by saying, here is our model profile. This is compliant with the standards. This means we can compare with other cities in Australia and around the world. This shows us some awesome things. Here we can see stationary energy is 46%, transport 31%, etc. We've been looking into further information, and we have another profile. This contains localised data for industry, kindly shared by our industry partners whom we love and we're working with, and this shows more industry stuff. For example, it shows the stationary energy component is larger because we have more accurate information on one or two of those big energy players. Providing breakdown on information if we've got it, being very clear and open as to what it really is and how valuable it is or it may not be. And then in other sections of our report, you then talk about the actions. You measure them separately to the community profile. You don't say that all of this solar on residential facilities and all of these bike lanes and all of these things are going to help us get from 800,000 tonnes to 700,000 tonnes, because all we're doing is setting ourselves up for failure. I don't think I'm totally sure, and people I've spoken with are sure on how this is going to be communicated, but I think we really need to start moving in this direction. Once we get the better data, we can then recouple. I've got no doubt about that. But at the moment, until we have the right data set, I think we need to change. All of this means nothing. Having a good profile, joining the program means absolutely nothing and results in zero emissions of production unless you actually do something. So setting targets, committing to programs, that won't result in a single tonne of emissions. What's important is how you leverage these commitments to advance the real game, which is enabling and engaging council communities to implement energy efficiency, renewable energy and emission reduction projects. We spoke to a few councils over the last few weeks and months who have joined on this program and asked them, how are you using it? Is it actually any value? And these are the sort of things that we are hearing and how it can be used. Got a really good point from Rob, who's saying, can we report on specific emission reductions for actions? Getting back to that last point, absolutely. I think we can certainly say that, this is what we can do. We can assist here. It's going to reduce by these certain emissions. And so instead of actually having an emissions reduction target, 800,000 down to 700,000, you're saying here is our profile. And separately, you're saying here are the sort of actions that we can do, and we think they're going to reduce emissions by 1,000 tonnes. Sorry, I'll get back to my train of thought, which is moving on this. And these were a lot of the questions. These were the last remaining questions. Thank you very much for that last question there. Before we move on to the very last one, though, I'm going to move over to Paul and ask him his thoughts, because he's had about 56 years of experience in the industry now. And I want to know, Paul, if I've committed to the City Power Partnership or the Compact of Mayors, how am I actually going to turn that into energy efficiency projects?
So this is tricky. So translating really high level goals, especially ones that are, you know, carbon neutral by 2030 or 2050 or whatever it is, into a strategy and into action can be quite tricky. The key thing to keep in mind is that targets are for political commitment. So it's your councillors and your community saying we agree with this target and this outcome. And then the strategy and the action is our job. So that's our job as practitioners to translate those high-level targets into how do we actually do it. When the targets are set, usually you don't know how you're actually going to do it. For example, if you've got a 5-star Green Star new building standard that has been approved by council, you don't actually know exactly how that's going to be delivered. You need to then go through an implementation process over the next 12, 24 months to help educate your staff, work with architects and builders, etc., to implement. So targets are not how you do things. 5, 7 years ago, most of the targets would not have a massive amount of renewable energy within them in terms of the strategy side of it. These days they do. Most targets and most strategies don't have a massive amount of battery storage in them. In 5 years' time, they probably will. So it's important to note that these targets should be long-term, they should be high level, and then it's our job to work through the strategy and the delivery. It's also important to probably split out some of the low-level policies and targets. So sometimes low-level policies and targets are signed off by your councillors at that community representation level. For example, it could be a sustainable building policy, and that is how you're going to build buildings for the next 10 years or whatever it is. So that can be a small level policy. That's different to a high level target. A similar example is sometimes councils will use financial policies and targets that are signed off by councillors to define what you do as practitioners. For example, it could be a 10-year payback. On any water and energy projects, the council says, if you find these projects, we will find the money to do it. And there's a number of councils that do that. So there's different types of policies and targets. The best ones give you as practitioners direction on what to do. Then it's your job to run around and do it. And we can talk for the next 4 hours on how to do it, but it's really important to separate those two. And then it's our job as practitioners to identify how to do it.
Thank you, Paul. There was another, in speaking to a few people before this webinar, similar, not even the fact that what others did say, and certainly if you can use it to get it into the highest level of documents as possible as well. So council has committed to the Compact of Mayors, which means A, B, C, D. You can get it into the council's plan. You can use it as, you know, for reporting up and down the chain. And then, as you've mentioned, Paul, great point to use it for sub-targets and what it means for buildings or residential, etc. If anyone else has ideas, and I know there are a few things that are coming into the questions box. One thing to remember that targets can change midway through an energy plan when the new council was elected. Absolutely, we're always going to have to deal with that. Or if you disagree, please feel free to say anything as well. A really good point that's come in from Hayley around as we move to bigger actions, and I think this is getting back to the point about decoupling emissions profiles from action in the community. He said, as we move to bigger actions such as large-scale solar, won't the emissions reductions be large enough and larger than the margin of error? In the past, they were probably smaller and less likely to make a difference. Yes, absolutely. And that would be the plan. At the moment, we do have good data for some areas. So, for example, for stationary energy, most of the time you can get pretty accurate postcode level data for residential emissions. and commercial. So often though, we've just seen this recently, and I'll invite Matt to talk to it in a second, where councils that thought they had a complete data set didn't, and they've been reporting on it, and they didn't actually have complete industrial emissions in there. And so we noticed this because when modelling or comparing it to a modelled approach where we look at statewide data and then proportion it or scale it according to GDP or gross regional product, it was really different. And so we'd noticed that a lot actually hadn't included industrial data. That'll get better. It already is getting better. Certainly transport at the moment, we could be paid $1 million to go and look into transport, and we'll certainly get it to be a lot more accurate, but we just don't think it's worth it at the moment. We think it's better having a platform using the GPC protocol, and then over the coming years working as a sector to try and get better data that can feed into it so everyone can use it. Matt, are you still there?
Yep, still here.
Did you want to make a final point just about in a minute, the round side of things? Because I know you've talked about this, but in the end, the whole idea is that, we will be able to say, here is our emissions profile that is accurate, and here is what the difference, here's what these actions will do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep it brief. This is something we can discuss for a bit of time. As Lex has gone through, the thinking behind sort of that decoupling is basically separating out there's two different actions that are taking place here. So the profiles themselves paint a picture of the municipality, broadly what's happening, sort of the scale of the the challenge ahead. And then when we're talking about targets, we're still going to be bound by the macro scale science-based targets of total emissions. But when we're talking about delineation and the decoupling, we're basically saying once a council is looking to establish an action plan, like an implementation strategy for trying to reduce emissions, using the municipal emissions profile as a way of gauging the success of that plan is very problematic at this stage, and likely to lead to a whole bunch of conflicts and issues and a very high probability at this stage of not representing the actual actions taken by the council. Like Lex was saying, the uncertainty associated with the metrics that are currently employed and the scale of the actions that are involved means that success or failure using the municipal profile as your benchmark is often subject to things that are largely outside of your control. And also very importantly, even if say the numbers happen to fall in a way that sort of showed that, say the program nominally had been successful, you're not getting a very confident correlation between the scale of the actions that are being implemented by the council and that resultant change. So we're saying that what's a better thing to do is to essentially use the municipal profile as a way of understanding your municipality, understanding the scale of the actions required, and sort of using that to ballpark essentially what sort of action plan look like. But in regards to assessing the efficacy of the action plan, the monitoring and evaluation, that should be developed based off metrics that are connected directly to the actions themselves, which will give you putting you in a much better situation of being able to say definitively, yes, we implemented these strategies and here is how effective they have been.
Yeah, great. Spot on. Thanks, Matt. You've explained it very well. Profile is there to understand. And look, I don't see any of this decoupling as a negative thing. I think it's just actually realising and accepting what has been happening for a long period of time. We can certainly get to a point where we can, recouple, for want of a better word. But at the moment, I don't think it's worth putting too much time and resources for any individual council into trying to get what they might think is a community inventory, when really we should be just keeping and looking at the GHG profiles at the moment. Prove us wrong. If people are aware or think they have a compliant inventory, I think it's an inventory, you think you've got one for your whole community that covers on all stationery, all transport and all waste, great. There are other people and smarter minds out there, I'm sure, that are looking and have looked at these things. We'd love to know, but certainly this is our approach now. All right, we have a minute left. Your last chance to put a question in, which we will probably not answer right now anyway, but sometime down the track. A few people have asked about that table that I showed earlier with the 4 key programs and how they measure up according to those 10 criteria. We will send it through and it won't have question marks. It will have green and red boxes. I think Paul's point, though, being a little bit mercenary as to what you want to get out of a program is the best way forward. Will a decoupled target, and I've just got 30 seconds I can answer this, satisfy the GCM? That must mean the compacted met. And yeah, absolutely. And if not, we'll bloody make it so. Like, you know, a lot of councils that joined and committed to the compacted mayors, they had targets for community before they even had a profile. So you can absolutely do that. And some of them ask questions, you know, why was it, how can you do that without having a profile first? And well, you just said that's the way we're going to do it here because we don't think having the profile is going to make much difference anyway. Yes, you've got 30 seconds, Matt.
Sure, no worries. So it's worth understanding like the nature of the profiles. Essentially, when we say a decoupled profile target, like we're saying, like we're separating out using the municipal profile as a way of gauging the tracking towards that target. The target is set up. We're advocating targets are set up based off the action plan. So essentially, understanding how to achieve the target will be developed based on actions. And those actions will, you know, that target will be essentially a figure. It'll be an absolute figure. That figure is what is submitted. And then there's a matter of like, you know, down the track, sort of once the scale of actions and the accuracy of the data converge, that recoupling of the municipal profiles to the actual implementation strategies of the council.
Great. Spot on. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, everyone, for attending and all the questions that you had. We'll have to wrap up our discussion because we know we've been late in the past and we want to try and 10 minutes over time, apologies. We hope you found it valuable. If you haven't, don't flag us off, just give us feedback and we'll get better, we promise. We'll actually be sending a feedback form after this session. And if you want to receive the presentation, and if you want to receive the little table that checks off all the programs according to those criteria, then you have to give us honest feedback. We put a lot of time into these and we want to make sure that we're hitting the mark. And also for those that haven't signed up to our newsletter, we don't send information on offers or deals. We basically send information on this sort of stuff. So we write reports and we develop and collate information and send it through. So jump on, sign up to our newsletter, give us the feedback, and we will be providing you a copy of the presentation. That is it for now. Thanks for coming, and we will catch you next time. Bye.